Lies My Teacher Told Me, by James W. Loewen. Introduction. There's a story we all know. It's about a young girl, trapped in a world of silence and darkness. Her name is Helen Keller. We've seen the movies, we've read the books. We can picture that iconic scene at the water pump, where her teacher, Anne Sullivan, spells the word W-A-T-E-R into her hand, and suddenly, the world unlocks. It's a beautiful story of a human spirit overcoming impossible odds. We're taught to see her as a symbol of inspiration, a testament to what anyone can achieve through sheer determination. And for most of us, that's where her story ends. But what if I told you that moment at the water pump wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of a much more radical and far more interesting one? What if the real Helen Keller, the adult Helen Keller who lived for another 64 years, was a fierce political activist, a radical socialist who praised the Russian Revolution, co-founded the ACLU, and fought for causes that would have made the newspapers that once celebrated her blush? What if the woman who fought so hard to learn to speak has been systematically silenced by the very history books that claim to honor her? This isn't just about Helen Keller. This is about us. It's about a fundamental question. What if the history you were taught in school wasn't just incomplete? What if it was intentionally designed to be misleading? This is the explosive idea at the heart of one of the most important books ever written on American history, Lies My Teacher Told Me, by the late, great sociologist and historian, James W. Loewen. For years, Loewen took 12 of the most popular American history textbooks, the ones sitting in classrooms all across the country, and he did something nobody had ever bothered to do. He read them carefully. He compared what they said to what historical records, primary sources, and professional historians actually knew. And what he found was staggering. He discovered a landscape of myths, distortions, and glaring omissions, all designed to present a sanitized, patriotic, and ultimately boring version of the American past. A version of history that leaves out the conflict, the controversy, and the complexity that makes the past so fascinating and so relevant to our lives today. By the end of our conversation today, you will understand the process he calls heroification, the secret formula for turning complex human beings into flawless, two-dimensional superheroes. You'll see how our most cherished national origin stories, from Christopher Columbus to the first Thanksgiving, are built on a foundation of convenient half-truths. And most importantly, you will gain a powerful new tool, the ability to look at any historical story, whether in a book, a movie, or a political speech, and ask the right questions to uncover what's really going on. This isn't about tearing America down. It's about finally growing up and seeing it for what it truly is, a nation more complex, more terrible, and more beautiful than anything you were ever told. Book summary. So, where do the lies begin? According to James Loewen, they start with a process he calls heroification. It's a beautiful word for a terrible process. It's what happens when our history books take real, flesh and blood people and turn them into pious, perfect creatures. They strip them of their conflicts, their mistakes, their pain, and in doing so, they strip them of their humanity. They become statues, not people. And this is why so many of us find history boring. Who can relate to a statue? Let's go back to Helen Keller. The story we're told is that of a young girl who overcame her disabilities. The moral of the story is simple. If she can do it, you can do it. It's the ultimate pull yourself up by your bootstraps tale. But Loewen points out that to tell this story, historians have to cut her life off after she graduates from college. They have to ignore the next 60-plus years of her existence. Because the adult Helen Keller doesn't fit the simple, inspirational narrative. The real Helen Keller joined the Socialist Party in 1909. She became a wobbly, a member of the radical industrial workers of the world. She hung a red flag in her study. Why? Because her own experience with disability opened her eyes to the world of inequality. She researched blindness and discovered it wasn't random. It was concentrated in the lower classes, where industrial accidents, poor medical care, and diseases like syphilis were rampant. She realized that dealing with blindness alone was just treating the symptom, not the cause. The cause was a system that created poverty and desperation. She wrote, "I have visited sweatshops, factories, crowded slums. If I could not see it, I could smell it." When she became a socialist, the same newspapers that had called her a miracle now called her delusional. They said her disabilities made her incapable of independent thought, that she was just a puppet for her radical teachers. Her response was brilliant. "Oh, ridiculous Brooklyn Eagle," she wrote. "Socially blind and deaf, it defends an intolerable system, a system that is the cause of much of the physical blindness and deafness which we are trying to prevent." She went on to help found the American Civil Liberties Union. She sent money and support to the NAACP, a radical act for a white woman from Alabama in the 1920s. Near the end of her life, she wrote a loving letter to the head of the American Communist Party, who was languishing in jail during the McCarthy era. Now, you don't have to agree with her politics. But the fact that this entire, passionate, politically engaged life has been erased is a profound lie by omission. History has made her mute. They sanitized her to make her a simple hero, but in the process, they made her boring. They robbed her of her true message. She herself wrote that she had once believed anyone could succeed if they just tried hard enough. But then she said, "As I went more and more about the country, I learned that I had spoken with assurance on a subject I knew little about. I learned that the power to rise in the world is not within the reach of everyone." This is an idea that our textbooks don't want to touch. An editor at a major publishing house told Loewen that there are 3 great taboos in textbook publishing: sex, religion, and social class. Textbooks want to sell the American dream, the idea that opportunity is equal for all. Helen Keller's life, her real life, challenges that myth directly. This process of heroification doesn't just apply to little people like Keller. It's even more pronounced with our leaders, like Woodrow Wilson. Ask most high school students about Wilson, and they'll tell you he was a great progressive president. He led America through World War I and championed the League of Nations. Some might even associate him with women's suffrage. And that's the picture our textbooks paint: Wilson the idealist, a man ahead of his time. But this portrait requires ignoring 2 massive parts of his presidency: his overt racism and his aggressive military interventions. Under Wilson, the United States intervened in Latin America more than at any other time in our history. We sent troops to Mexico, Haiti, Cuba, Panama, and the Dominican Republic. These weren't benevolent missions to spread democracy. They were invasions to impose American economic and political control, often setting the stage for brutal dictatorships that would haunt those countries for decades. Textbooks twist themselves into knots to excuse this. The Challenge of Freedom says, President Wilson wanted the United States to build friendships with the countries of Latin America. However, he found this difficult. It's a classic case of blaming the victim. The American pageant goes further, claiming, necessity was the mother of armed Caribbean intervention. Then there's Wilson's unknown war with Russia. In 1918, Wilson sent thousands of American troops to invade Russia to try and overthrow the new communist government. Not a single one of the 12 textbooks Loewen surveyed even mentions this. It's a historical black hole. Why? Because it makes Wilson and the United States look like aggressors, not idealists. It complicates the hero narrative. But it's Wilson's racism that is perhaps the most shocking omission. Woodrow Wilson was an outspoken white supremacist. He told racist darky jokes in cabinet meetings. As president of Princeton, he refused to admit black students. And when he became president of the United States, he systematically segregated the federal government, which had been integrated to some extent since the Civil War. He fired black officials and appointed Southern whites to positions traditionally held by African Americans. He personally praised the film Birth of a Nation, a disgusting, racist glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. After a private screening at the White House, Wilson said of the film, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is also true." This presidential endorsement helped spark the rebirth of the Klan as a powerful national movement. This isn't just a character flaw. It's a fundamental part of his presidency that had devastating consequences for race relations in America for decades to come. Yet, most textbooks either ignore it completely or give it a single sanitized sentence. The American way even invents a happy ending, claiming that segregationist policies in his administration gradually were ended. This is simply false. By presenting Wilson as a hero, textbooks are written from a white perspective. No black person, Loewen argues, could ever consider Woodrow Wilson a hero. The cover-up denies all of us the chance to understand the dangerous connection between racist leadership and public violence. So why did they do it? Why turn complex, flawed men and women into saints? Because it serves a purpose. It creates what Loewen calls a social archetype. Wilson becomes the archetype of the good, idealist president. It makes us feel good about our country. It promotes a blind, unthinking patriotism. And it avoids controversy. The problem is, this process makes students stupid. When we are only shown perfect heroes, we fail to see that real people, with real flaws, can still achieve great things. We fail to see ourselves in them. It makes history feel like a parade of perfect men and noble nations, which, as Loewen says, does not tell the truth. And when students eventually find out they've been lied to, they don't just become cynical about the heroes, they become cynical about history itself. Now, let's apply this lens of heroification to the very beginning of the American story, to the man our textbooks present as America's first great hero, Christopher Columbus. The story we all learned is a simple, dramatic tale. Columbus, a humble man from Genoa, believes the world is round while everyone else thinks it's flat. He bravely sails his 3 tiny ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, across an unknown ocean, facing a mutinous crew, until at last, on October 12, 1492, he discovers the New World. It's a story of courage, vision, and perseverance. Unfortunately, Loewen reveals, almost every part of that story is wrong. First, the flat Earth myth. It's a complete fabrication. In 1492, almost every educated person in Europe knew the world was round. Sailors knew it from watching ships disappear over the horizon, hull first, then mast. The real debate wasn't about the shape of the Earth, it was about its size. Columbus was wrong. He thought the Earth was much smaller than it is. He was lucky America was in the way, or he and his crew would have starved. The myth of the flat earthers was largely invented in the 19th century by Washington Irving in his biography of Columbus to make his hero seem more scientific and forward-thinking than his contemporaries. Second, the idea of discovery. Textbooks have gotten a little better about this, sometimes putting the word discover in quotes. But the entire narrative is still framed from a European perspective. The Americas weren't a vacant wilderness. They were a land inhabited by millions of people, with complex societies, sprawling cities, and diverse cultures. Columbus wasn't the first to arrive, he was the last. People had been living here for thousands of years. Vikings had established a colony in Newfoundland 500 years before Columbus. And evidence suggests that Africans, Chinese, and Polynesians may have also made voyages to the Americas long before 1492. So why is Columbus so important? Loewen argues it has less to do with Columbus the man and more to do with the changes happening in Europe. Europe in 1492 was ready to take advantage of his voyage in a way it wasn't before. It had developed the military technology, guns and cannons mounted on ships, to conquer. It had developed the social technology, bureaucracy and double-entry bookkeeping, to manage far-flung empires. And it had developed an ideology, a version of Christianity that rationalized conquest and a lust for gold, that provided the motivation. As Columbus himself wrote, "Gold is most excellent. He who has it does all he wants in the world, and can even lift souls up to paradise." This brings us to the darkest part of the Columbus story, the part almost universally omitted from our history books, what happened after he landed. Columbus's voyages were not about exploration. they were about conquest and exploitation. His first impression of the native Arawak people of the Caribbean was that they were handsome, intelligent, and gentle. But he quickly got down to business. In his own journal, he wrote, "I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as I pleased." And that's exactly what he did. On his second voyage, he returned with 17 ships, over 1,200 men, cannons, crossbows, and attack dogs. What followed was a reign of terror. The Spaniards demanded gold, food, and women. When the Arawaks resisted, Columbus made war. His men mowed them down with guns, skewered them on pikes, and loosed dogs to rip them apart. He initiated a tribute system, forcing every Arawak over the age of 14 to bring him a certain amount of gold every 3 months. Those who failed had their hands cut off and were left to bleed to death. The system was impossible. There wasn't that much gold on the island. So the people fled to the mountains, where they starved. Others committed mass suicide, killing their own children to save them from the Spanish. Columbus also initiated the transatlantic slave trade. On one expedition, he rounded up 1,500 Arawaks and shipped the best 500 to Spain to be sold as slaves. 200 died on the voyage. The rest he gave to his men as slaves. The result was a full-scale genocide. When Columbus arrived in 1492, the population of Haiti was possibly as high as 8 million people. By 1516, only 12,000 were left. By 1555, they were all gone. This, Loewen argues, is the true legacy of Columbus. He introduced two phenomena that revolutionized the modern world: the taking of land, wealth, and labor from indigenous peoples, leading to their near extermination, and the transatlantic slave trade, which created a racial underclass. Why is this horrific story replaced with the feel-good myth of a brave navigator? Because Columbus is an origin myth. He is our first hero. His story is meant to tell us that America was founded on courage and vision, not on greed, violence, and genocide. It allows us, as Loewen says, to accept the contemporary division of the world into developed and underdeveloped spheres as natural and given, rather than a historical product. It makes our prosperity seem like a reward for our virtue, not the result of a brutal conquest. This pattern of sanitizing our origins continues with our next great founding myth, the first Thanksgiving. The story is heartwarming. A small band of pilgrims, escaping religious persecution, land at Plymouth Rock in 1620. They endure a harsh winter, but with the help of friendly Indians, especially a man named Squanto who teaches them how to plant corn, they have a bountiful harvest. In the fall of 1621, they hold a feast and invite their Indian friends to celebrate, a beautiful moment of interracial harmony that becomes the foundation of our national holiday. It's a lovely story. But again, it's a lie. The first lie is one of omission. What happened just before the Pilgrims arrived? Between 1616 and 1619, a massive epidemic, likely introduced by European fishermen, swept through the coastal tribes of New England. It was one of the most devastating plagues in human history, wiping out between 90 and 96% of the native population. Entire villages were left empty, the ground littered with skulls and bones. This is the real reason the Pilgrims survived. They didn't land in a vast and virgin continent, as our textbooks love to say. They landed in a recently widowed one. The beautiful, cleared fields they found at Plymouth weren't a gift from God. They were the former cornfields of the Patuxet tribe, whose inhabitants had all died in the plague. The Pilgrims literally settled in a graveyard. The Puritan leaders saw this as a miracle. Governor John Winthrop wrote that God had cleared our title to this place by sweeping the natives away with smallpox. This is the first, dark Thanksgiving. Then there's Squanto, the friendly Indian helper. The textbooks tell us he learned English from fishermen. That's a bit of an understatement. In 1614, Squanto was captured by a British slave raider, taken to Spain, and sold into slavery. He escaped, made his way to England, and spent several years there before finally convincing a captain to take him back home. When he finally arrived back at his home village of Patuxet in 1619, he discovered that he was the last of his tribe. Every other man, woman, and child was dead from the plague. This is the real reason he helped the pilgrims. He had nowhere else to go. His entire world had been destroyed. This isn't a happy story of a helpful friend. It's a tragic story of a refugee clinging to the very people who represented the culture that had destroyed his own. And what about that peaceful feast? The textbooks don't tell you that just a few days after landing, the pilgrims robbed the graves of the Wampanoag people, stealing their winter corn supplies and desecrating their dead. The Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, didn't form an alliance with the pilgrims out of pure friendship. He did it because his tribe had been so weakened by the plague that he feared his tribal rivals, the Narragansetts. He needed the pilgrims' guns as much as they needed his help. The peace didn't last long. Within a generation, the English colonists and the Indian tribes were engaged in a brutal war, King Philip's War, that, in proportion to population, was the deadliest war in American history. By the end, the Indian cultures of New England were shattered. So, the Thanksgiving story we tell is a myth that buries the horrific reality of conquest and disease. It transforms a story of tragedy and conflict into one of harmony and divine providence. It makes us feel good about our origins. It reassures us that we were welcomed here, that our claim to this land is legitimate and peaceful. It turns a story of invasion into a story of settlement. And this brings us to a larger theme in Loewen's book: the way history textbooks systematically erase the perspectives of anyone who isn't a white, male leader. Let's look at how textbooks treat Native Americans in general. They are often presented as primitive, roaming hunters who stood in the way of civilization. This is what Loewen calls the primitive to civilized continuum. It's a ladder of progress, with savages at the bottom and modern, industrial Europeans at the top. This view is profoundly wrong. Many Native American societies were not nomadic. They were sophisticated agriculturalists who lived in settled towns and cities. The city of Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, had a population of 40,000 around the year 1200 AD, larger than London at the time. Native Americans domesticated more than half of the food crops now grown around the world, from potatoes and corn to tomatoes and chocolate. Textbooks also ignore the profound influence that Native American ideas had on European and American culture. The Iroquois League, a sophisticated democratic confederation of 5 later 6 nations, served as a model for Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union, a forerunner to our own Constitution. Franklin himself wrote, "It would be a strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union. And yet that a like union should be impracticable for 10 or a dozen English colonies." Many Europeans who came to America were so captivated by the freedom, equality, and sense of community in native societies that they chose to leave white society and live as Indians. Benjamin Franklin noted this phenomenon: "No European who has tasted savage life can afterwards bear to live in our societies." Colonists were always defecting to Indian tribes. Indians almost never chose to become civilized. This embarrassing fact, which directly challenges the myth of European superiority, is completely absent from our textbooks. The history of Native Americans, as told by our textbooks, is a history seen through white eyes. It's a story of settlers moving into a wilderness and encountering hostile Indians. It completely erases the reality that whites were the invaders, and Native Americans were defending their homes. By presenting the conquest as inevitable, a natural result of progress, textbooks absolve us of any moral responsibility for what happened. This is why Loewen says that to understand this part of our history, we must look at it with red eyes. This process of making people invisible extends, most powerfully, to African Americans. The story of black-white relations, Loewen argues, is the central, defining theme of American history. It's our American obsession. And yet, our textbooks have historically done everything possible to hide the true nature of slavery and racism. Before the Civil Rights Movement, textbooks often presented slavery through the Magnolia myth of Gone with the Wind. It was a benevolent institution where happy, childlike slaves were cared for by kind masters. A famous 1950 textbook even said that Samba suffered less than any other class in the South from its peculiar institution. Today, textbooks are much better. They acknowledge the brutality of slavery. But Loewen argues they still fail in two crucial ways. First, they fail to explain the cause of racism. They treat racism as a sort of unfortunate, natural prejudice that just exists, like bad weather. They don't show how racism was created as an ideology to justify the economic system of slavery. Before Europeans began the African slave trade, they didn't necessarily see Africans as inferior. But as the slave trade grew more profitable, a racist ideology was developed to rationalize it. It became convenient to believe that Africans were subhuman, uncivilized, and destined for slavery. Racism, Loewen shows, is not the cause of slavery, but the result of it. The social structure of slavery created the superstructure of racism. This is a profoundly important idea, because it shows that racism isn't a natural, unchangeable feature of human nature. It's a historical creation. But no textbook makes this connection. Second, textbooks fail to show the impact of slavery on white America. They treat slavery as a problem for black people, not as a system that corrupted the very soul of the nation. They heroify figures like Thomas Jefferson, quoting his beautiful words about all men being created equal, while downplaying the fact that he was a lifelong slave owner who enslaved hundreds of people, including his own children. They present the Founding Fathers as if their slaveholding was a minor footnote, not a central contradiction that shaped their political thought and the nation they created. Slavery dominated American foreign policy for decades. The desire to protect and expand slavery drove the wars against the Seminole Indians who were harboring runaway slaves, the Texas Revolution fought for the freedom to own slaves, and the Mexican-American War. But textbooks disconnect these events from their cause, leaving students with a jumbled, incoherent story. Nowhere is this historical blindness more apparent than in the treatment of the period after the Civil War. Reconstruction is often portrayed as a time of corruption and failure, when ignorant blacks and greedy carpetbaggers ran the South into the ground. This is the Confederate myth of Reconstruction, a racist lie designed to justify the violent overthrow of biracial governments and the return of white supremacy. Today's textbooks have corrected the worst of this myth, but they still frame the problem backwards. They talk about the problem of integrating African Americans into society. But as Loewen points out, blacks were already integrated, they were doing all the work. The real problem of Reconstruction was how to integrate the ex-Confederates, the white supremacists, into a new, more democratic order. And when the federal government gave up on that task, Reconstruction failed. What followed was what historians call the nadir of American race relations, the period from 1890 to 1940 when segregation was legally imposed, lynchings reached an all-time high, and African Americans were systematically stripped of their civil and political rights across the entire country, not just in the South. This was the era when the Ku Klux Klan was a mainstream political force, when Woodrow Wilson segregated the White House, and when race riots, initiated by whites, terrorized black communities from Tulsa to Chicago. This entire horrific period is almost completely invisible in our history textbooks. By ignoring it, they create a false narrative of steady progress in race relations. We had slavery, then it ended. Then we had the civil rights movement, and now everything is fine. This cheerful story makes white students feel comfortable and complacent, and it makes the continuing struggles of African Americans seem incomprehensible. It leads to the dangerous and false conclusion that if black people are still facing problems today, it must be their own fault. This brings us to the final, overarching theme of American history textbooks, the myth of progress. From their opening pages to their final, vapid conclusions, textbooks are selling one big idea, that American history is a story of continuous, inevitable improvement. Everything is always getting better. This faith in progress serves many purposes. It justifies the status quo. It makes us feel good about our nation's past and optimistic about its future. It provides a tidy rationale for our wealth and power. But Loewen argues it is also a dangerous lie. It's a lie because it's not true. History is not a straight line of upward progress. Race relations, for example, were in many ways better in 1870 than they were in 1920. The gap between the rich and the poor has widened dramatically in recent decades. The idea of progress is a chronological form of ethnocentrism. It makes us believe that we are more advanced, more tolerant, and more sophisticated than people in the past, which is often not the case. And it blinds us to the real challenges we face. Textbooks end with cheerful platitudes about how American ingenuity will solve all our problems. But they avoid any serious discussion of the most pressing issues of our time, like environmental degradation. They don't want to challenge the idea that bigger is always better, that endless economic growth is possible on a finite planet. By presenting a history of trouble-free progress, they make students passive. They teach them that the future is a process over which they have no control, that things will just get better on their own. And this may be the most profound lie of all. Because it robs us of our agency. It teaches us to be spectators of our own history, not participants. Finally, Loewen points out how textbooks avoid the recent past, what he calls the Sasha, the time of the living dead, the period that still exists in the memory of people who are alive today. Textbooks rush through the 1960s, the Vietnam War, and Watergate. Why? Because the recent past is controversial. People have opinions about it. It's messy. It's unresolved. It's much safer to stick to the Zamani, the distant past of revered, dead ancestors. The result is that high school students are profoundly ignorant of the very history that most directly shapes their lives. They know more about the War of 1812 than the Vietnam War. They have no resources to understand the debates that rage around them, from foreign policy to race relations to environmentalism. So, why is history taught this way? Loewen explores a web of causes. The pressure from textbook adoption boards in states like Texas and California, which are often influenced by conservative and ultra-patriotic groups. The profit-driven nature of the publishing industry, which seeks to create a one-size-fits-all product that offends no one and therefore has no flavor. The authors themselves, who often feel a misguided sense of duty to make students feel proud of their country, even if it means lying to them. The teachers, who are often overworked, undertrained in history, and afraid of controversy. But in the end, Loewen argues, we are all complicit. We live in a culture that often prefers comforting myths to uncomfortable truths. We want to believe in our own exceptionalism, in our own goodness. Textbooks reflect this desire. They are mirrors of our own unwillingness to look our history squarely in the eye. But Loewen's ultimate message is one of hope. It's not a hope based on blind optimism, but on the power of critical thinking. He believes that if we can learn to approach history not as a set of facts to be memorized, but as a series of questions to be investigated, then we can free ourselves from the lies of the past. He wants us to become our own historians. To look at every story, every monument, every textbook, and ask, who is telling this story? Whose perspective is left out? Who benefits from this version of history? Is it believable? How is it trying to make me feel? This is the real purpose of learning history. Not to celebrate or condemn, but to understand. To understand how we got here, and to gain the wisdom to choose where we go next. Because the truth, as Loewen so powerfully reminds us, doesn't just make us smarter. The truth is the only thing that can truly set us free. Commentary. Reading James Loewen's Lies My Teacher Told Me is like putting on a new pair of glasses. Suddenly, the blurry, black-and-white landscape of history that you were shown in school snaps into sharp, vibrant, and often unsettling color. It's a book that doesn't just teach you history, it teaches you how to think about history. And in doing so, it gives you a powerful toolkit for thinking about the world. The most profound lesson for me, and I think for anyone who reads this book, is the deconstruction of the idea of heroes. We are raised to believe that history is the story of great men, and occasionally, great women, who were smarter, braver, and better than the rest of us. Loewen shows us that this isn't just an oversimplification, it's a crippling way to view the past. By making our historical figures into flawless saints, we rob them of their humanity, and we rob ourselves of the ability to connect with them. When you learn that Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, held racist views that he struggled with his entire life, it doesn't diminish his greatness. It makes it more profound. It shows that greatness isn't about being perfect, it's about the capacity to grow, to struggle with your own contradictions, and to rise above them. It makes his achievements feel more human, and therefore, more attainable. This book also fundamentally changed my understanding of what it means to be a citizen. The version of history we're taught in school is often a passive one. The government passes laws, presidents make decisions, and progress just happens. It's a story that implicitly tells us that our role is to be quiet, to vote every few years, and to trust that the people in charge know what they're doing. Loewen demolishes this myth. He shows us that real change in America has almost never come from the top down. It has come from the bottom up. It has come from abolitionists, from suffragists, from labor union organizers, from civil rights marchers. It has come from ordinary people who saw an injustice and refused to accept it. By hiding this history of dissent and struggle, textbooks disempower us. They make us forget that the greatest legacy of our country isn't blind obedience, it's the right, and the responsibility, to challenge authority when it is wrong. So, how can you start putting the lessons of this book into practice today? Here are a few simple ideas. First, become a historical detective in your own life. The next time you encounter a historical story, whether it's in a movie, a news article, or a family anecdote, apply Loewen's 5 critical questions. Ask, why was this story created? Whose perspective is being told, and whose is missing? Is this account believable? Can I find other sources that confirm or contradict it? And finally, how is this story trying to make me feel about the world? This simple practice will transform you from a passive consumer of information into an active, critical thinker. Second, embrace the Sasha. Talk to the older people in your life, your parents, your grandparents, your neighbors. Ask them about the historical events they lived through. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the fall of the Berlin Wall. What do they remember? How did it feel? You'll find that their living memories are often richer, more complex, and more contradictory than any textbook account. You will be connecting to a living history that is quickly fading. And third, look at the landscape around you. Find a historical marker in your town. Who does it honor? What story does it tell? Then, go to your local library or historical society and dig a little deeper. Is the story on the marker the whole story? What was left out? You might be surprised by what you find. This isn't just an academic exercise. It's an act of reclaiming your own history, of understanding that the past is not a settled, dusty thing in a book, but a living, contested story that is all around us, shaping our world in ways we rarely see. That was a summary of Lies My Teacher Told Me by James W. Loewen. We've explored the core ideas today, but honestly, a summary can only scratch the surface. The real power of this book lies in the details, in the hundreds of shocking, funny, and tragic stories that Loewen uncovers. It's in the quiet moments of reading when you realize just how much of what you thought was true isn't. This summary is meant to be a map, to help you decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity or made you question what you've been taught, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts, it's an experience that can fundamentally change the way you see your country, your world, and yourself. You'll find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable and it gave you a new perspective, please take a moment to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's continue to challenge what we know and grow wiser together.